The flight attendant scanned the first-class cabin, her sharp eyes landing on two siblings sitting quietly in their seats. Something in her expression shifted. Doubt, suspicion, before she strode toward them with purpose. "You need to move, now." The girl blinked, confused. "But these are our seats." The attendant's tone hardened. "I don't think so." Heads turned. Whispers spread. Within minutes, security was called and the two were forced off the plane, humiliated, confused, and unaware of one crucial detail. Their father owned the airline, and when he found out, the flight attendant wouldn't just regret her mistake. She would wish she had never made it. Before we dive into the full story, let me know where in the world you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get started. The airport buzzed with movement. Passengers hurried to their gates, their voices blending with the constant announcements overhead. Two siblings, Elena and Noah, stood near the boarding area, gripping their first-class tickets tightly. Elena, 17, checked her phone one last time, making sure everything was in order. Beside her, 12-year-old Noah shifted excitedly, his backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. "How long until we board?" Noah asked, rocking on his heels. Elena glanced at the screen above the gate. "Any minute now," she replied, slipping her phone into her pocket. Their father had booked them first-class seats, something they weren't used to. She could tell Noah was eager for the experience. When their boarding group was called, they moved forward, handing their passes to the gate agent, who barely glanced at them before waving them through. The moment they stepped onto the plane, Noah's eyes widened. The first-class cabin was nothing like the crowded economy seats they were used to. The space, the plush seats, the quiet, it all felt surreal. "Whoa," Noah whispered, his gaze darting around. Elena smiled, nudging him forward. "Come on, let's find our seats." They reached their row, placing their bags carefully in the overhead bin before settling in. Elena adjusted her seatbelt while Noah reached for the window shade, peeking outside. A few rows ahead, Margaret Langley, a senior flight attendant, moved through the aisle with a polished smile, greeting passengers as she checked seat assignments. She was tall and composed, her uniform impeccably pressed, her posture straight and authoritative. As she reached Elena and Noah's row, her steps slowed. Something unreadable flickered across her face before she tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Elena looked up, confused. "Yes, these are ours." She pulled out the tickets and handed them over. Margaret took them, scanning the details. Her expression remained unreadable, but her grip on the tickets tightened slightly before she handed them back. "This is first class," she stated flatly, as if they hadn't already known. Elena nodded. "We know." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Who booked these seats for you?" Elena inhaled slowly, feeling Noah shift uncomfortably beside her. "Our father did," she answered evenly. Margaret didn't move for a moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Noah leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Why did she ask that?" Elena exhaled. "I don't know." Minutes later, Margaret returned, this time with Thomas Reed, another flight attendant. He was older, with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Stopping in front of them, he cleared his throat. "We need you both to step out of first class for a moment," Thomas said, his tone neutral but firm. "We have to verify something about your tickets." Elena's stomach tightened. "Verify what? We already showed them to her." "It's just a quick check," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Please come with us." Noah's excitement vanished. His fingers curled around the armrest. "Why do we have to move?" he asked in a small voice. Margaret folded her arms. "We can do this the easy way, or we can call security." The way she said it, like a warning, like a threat, made Elena's chest tighten. She could feel the stares now, the way passengers had started paying attention. Yet none of them spoke up. No one said a word in their defense. Elena forced herself to stay calm. She grabbed their bags, nudging Noah to follow. He hesitated but obeyed, lowering his head as they walked down the aisle. The whispers trailed behind them, but not a single voice stood up for them. Noah hesitated but obeyed, his head lowered as they walked down the aisle. The whispers followed them, soft but unmistakable. Yet, not a single voice spoke up in their defense. The moment they stepped off the plane, The doors shut behind them, with a finality that sent a chill down Elena's spine. A uniformed security officer stood nearby, arms crossed, watching them as if they were a problem that needed to be dealt with. Elena's hands shook as she reached for her phone, scrolling quickly to her father's number. Beside her, Noah stood motionless, his shoulders slumped, the excitement from earlier now completely drained from his small frame. She pressed the call button. "Dad," she said the moment he picked up, her voice unsteady, "they just kicked us off the plane." Silence. Then her father's slow, measured response. "Who did?" Elena turned slightly, watching as Margaret Langley and Thomas Reed reboarded the plane without hesitation, leaving them behind. Her jaw clenched. "The flight crew," she said quietly. Another pause. But this time, it wasn't confusion. It wasn't disbelief. It was something else. Something cold. "Stay where you are," her father said, his voice unreadable. "Don't speak to anyone. I'll handle this." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. Elena lowered the phone from her ear, gripping it tightly. Noah looked up at her with worried eyes. His hands clutched the straps of his backpack, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's Dad gonna do?" Elena exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I don't think they're ready for it." The airport terminal suddenly felt different. A place that had been filled with excitement just moments ago now felt cold, distant, unwelcoming. Other passengers walked past them without a second glance, their faces neutral, uninterested in the two kids who had just been thrown off their flight. A security officer stood near the gate, his arms still crossed, watching them like they had done something wrong. Elena resisted the urge to glare at him. They hadn't caused any trouble. They hadn't raised their voices. They had simply sat in their assigned seats. And yet, here they were, standing outside the plane, while their first-class seats remained empty. Noah sighed and dropped into one of the chairs near the window, fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. Elena remained standing, her mind racing. Their father, Victor Monroe, was a patient man, but she knew him well enough to understand that there were certain lines people couldn't cross. And this was one of them. A few minutes later, Elena's phone vibrated in her hand. It was a message from her father. "Dad. Flight number. Gate number. I need names." Elena's fingers flew over the screen, quickly typing back the details. Her heart pounded. She knew her father's calm tone didn't mean he wasn't furious. It meant he was thinking, calculating. Victor Monroe wasn't the kind of man who yelled or made threats. He handled problems with precision. And when he moved, people listened. Elena put her phone away and glanced back at Noah. "Dad's handling it," she told him. Noah nodded, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. "Are we getting back on the plane?" Elena hesitated. "I don't know." Noah sighed again, kicking his feet slightly as he stared out at the planes on the tarmac. "I didn't like how they looked at us," he muttered. "Like we weren't supposed to be there." Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides. He was right. Margaret Langley hadn't looked at them with suspicion because of their tickets. She had looked at them like they didn't belong, like she had already decided what kind of people they were, the second she saw them. Minutes passed in silence. Then, just as Elena was about to check her phone again, the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, Margaret Langley. Please report to the front desk immediately." Elena's eyes snapped toward the gate. Noah sat up straighter. "What do you think that's about?" Elena didn't answer, but deep down she already knew. Something was happening, and Margaret Langley had no idea what was coming. Margaret smoothed the front of her uniform as she approached the front desk, her usual composure intact. She didn't like being summoned like this, especially over the intercom, where passengers could hear. It made it seem like she had done something wrong. And Margaret Langley prided herself on always maintaining control. But as she reached the counter, she noticed something. The gate agent looked tense, and standing just behind him was a man she recognized instantly. A man she never thought she'd have to answer to directly, Victor Monroe. And just like that, for the first time in years, Margaret felt her stomach drop. Ethan Coleman, the gate supervisor, was waiting for her. His expression was unreadable, but something in his rigid, professional stance made Margaret Langley straighten her posture instinctively. "You needed me?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Ethan nodded but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, gesturing toward a side entrance where an airport official stood, holding a phone to his ear. The man glanced at Margaret before speaking into the receiver. "Yes, sir. She's here now." Margaret frowned slightly. "Who is that?" Ethan exhaled and lowered his voice. "We just got a call from corporate. Direct orders from Victor Monroe." The name hit her like ice water down her spine. She blinked. "Excuse me?" Ethan's lips tightened. "Apparently those two kids you removed from first class, their father owns this airline." For the first time in years, Margaret felt unsteady. Her grip on her clipboard tightened as she processed what he had just said. Victor Monroe. Not a high-status frequent flyer. Not some executive's friend, the owner of the airline. Her stomach twisted. Ethan continued, his voice carefully measured. "Mr. Monroe is personally involved now, and he wants an explanation immediately." Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. This wasn't just a passenger complaint. This was a career-ending mistake. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. "It was a simple misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I had reason to believe their seats were a mistake, so I followed procedure and asked them to step out while we verified." Ethan cut her off with a sharp look. "Did you verify first, or did you assume?" The question hit her harder than she expected. Margaret opened her mouth, but found no immediate answer. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his forehead. "They're still waiting in the terminal. Mr. Monroe's office just sent new orders. You will personally escort them back onto the plane." Margaret's breath caught. "And you will issue an apology in front of the passengers." Her stomach lurched. "What?" "You heard me," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Corporate is watching this now. The last thing this airline needs is a discrimination scandal. You will fix this." Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. Moments ago, she had been in control, and now she was being forced to clean up her own mess. She forced a tight smile. "Of course, I'll take care of it." But as she turned to head back toward the terminal, her mind raced. Passengers had seen her throw Elena and Noah off the plane. And now, those same passengers were about to see her bring them back. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one with the power, and she hated it. Elena sat stiffly in the waiting area, arms crossed, her phone resting in her lap. Noah fidgeted beside her, his sneakers tapping lightly against the floor. He had been quiet for the past few minutes, stealing glances at the gate where passengers continued to board, acting as if nothing had happened. But she could still feel the stares, the silent judgment. No one had stepped in when they were told to leave. But now that they were still sitting outside the plane, people had begun to whisper. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up immediately. "Dad, stay put. They're coming back for you." Her eyebrows pulled together. "Coming back?" Before she could type a response, the familiar clicking of heels made her stomach twist. Margaret Langley appeared, walking toward them with a tight-lipped expression. Her usual confidence was still there, but there was something else now. Something she was trying hard to mask. Noah straightened in his seat. "She looks mad," he muttered. Elena let out a slow breath. "She should be." Margaret stopped in front of them, clearing her throat. "Miss Monroe? Mr. Monroe?" Her voice was strained. "There has been an oversight." Elena narrowed her eyes. "An oversight?" Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes, after reviewing the seating arrangements, we have confirmed that your tickets are in fact correct." She exhaled sharply. "You are welcome to return to your first-class seats." Elena didn't move. She studied Margaret's expression, watching the way her fingers curled slightly against her palm. The way her shoulders held just a little more tension than before. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even embarrassed. She was just angry that she had to stand here and say it. Noah glanced between them before leaning closer to his sister. "Do we have to go back?" he whispered. Elena looked at him, her heart squeezing at the way he sounded so unsure, so small. The excitement he had felt earlier had completely disappeared. She turned back to Margaret Langley. "We'll go back," she said, her voice steady, "but I want to hear you say it." Margaret's expression twitched. "Say what?" Elena's gaze didn't waver. "You assumed we didn't belong there." The silence between them was suffocating. Margaret's fingers twitched slightly, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "I misjudged the situation." "That's not what I asked," Elena said calmly. Margaret inhaled sharply, glancing over her shoulder toward the gate desk, where Ethan Coleman stood with his arms crossed, watching her every move. Her jaw clenched before she turned back to the siblings. "I made an assumption," she admitted through gritted teeth, "and I was wrong." Elena let the words hang in the air for a moment before finally standing, grabbing her backpack. Noah adjusted the straps on his shoulders and followed her. As they walked back toward the plane, Margaret led the way, her posture stiff, her movements precise. Noah glanced up at Elena. "She didn't mean that," he muttered. Elena gave a small nod. "I know." And that was what made this even worse. The walk back to the plane felt different. Elena and Noah weren't the same two passengers who had boarded earlier. Excited, unaware. Now, every step felt heavier, weighed down by what had happened. Margaret walked ahead of them, her uniform still perfectly pressed, her head held high. But she didn't look back at them. She didn't acknowledge them beyond the forced apology she had been ordered to give. As they reached the jet bridge, Elena noticed the way the flight attendants near the entrance stiffened when they saw her and Noah returning. The shift in their expressions, the tension in their shoulders. It was clear. They all knew exactly what had happened. At the door, Thomas Reed stood, his hands clasped behind his back. His voice was flat when he spoke. "Welcome back, Miss Monroe. Mr. Monroe, your seats are ready for you." Noah hesitated slightly before stepping onto the plane. Glancing at Elena for reassurance, she gave him a small nod. Then she followed. The moment they stepped into the first-class cabin, the atmosphere changed. Conversations quieted, heads turned. Some passengers quickly looked away, pretending to be focused on their books or in-flight screens. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity, watching the siblings openly, waiting to see what would happen next. Elena's eyes flicked toward their seats. Untouched, waiting. Margaret cleared her throat and stepped aside stiffly. "Please, take your seats." Elena and Noah walked past her without another word. Elena settled into her window seat, adjusting her backpack beside her. Noah sat down more hesitantly, his hands gripping the armrests. The silence felt suffocating. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. "It's about time." Elena turned her head slightly. An older man across the aisle, dressed in a tailored suit, had spoken. He shifted in his seat, but he didn't meet her eyes. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to Margaret. Margaret stiffened, but didn't respond. Another voice, softer this time, a woman a few rows ahead. They should have never been asked to leave in the first place. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time since they boarded, Elena saw something flicker across her face. Something that looked a lot like embarrassment. Without another word, Margaret turned sharply on her heel and walked toward the front of the cabin. Noah let out a slow breath. "That was weird," he muttered. Elena kept her gaze forward. "She's not in control anymore," she said simply. And for Margaret Langley, that was the worst part of all. Margaret disappeared behind the curtain at the front of the cabin. But Elena knew she wasn't far. The way she had walked off so quickly, the tension in her shoulders, it was obvious. She was struggling to hold herself together. This wasn't just about being forced to bring them back. This was about losing control. Noah fidgeted beside her, adjusting his seatbelt even though the plane hadn't moved. He still looked uneasy. His fingers tapped against the armrest. "Are we really just supposed to sit here like nothing happened?" Elena didn't answer right away. She could still feel the stares, the weight of everyone's curiosity pressing in on them. The same passengers who had ignored them when they were thrown off the plane were suddenly interested now. But none of them had done anything when it mattered. Noah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Are we really just supposed to sit here like nothing happened?" he muttered under his breath. Elena didn't answer right away. She could still feel the stares, the weight of everyone's curiosity pressing in on them. The same passengers who had ignored them when they were thrown off the plane were suddenly interested now that they were back. A flight attendant approached cautiously. Her name tag read Lena Carter. She was younger than Margaret Langley, her expression unreadable, but not unkind. She hesitated before speaking. "Would you like anything to drink before takeoff?" she asked, her voice softer than the others had been. Noah didn't say anything, but Elena could feel how tense he was. She glanced up at Lena, narrowing her eyes slightly. "Did you ask everyone else that when they first sat down?" Lena's expression flickered, but she didn't look away. No, she admitted. I didn't. Elena let the silence stretch between them before finally answering. Water, for both of us. Lena gave a small nod and walked away. Noah turned to his sister, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did you ask that? Because she wants to make things right, Elena said simply, but she didn't do anything when it mattered. Noah frowned, sinking further into his seat. He hadn't even touched the in-flight screen in front of him, something that would have excited him an hour ago. That excitement had been stolen, and in its place, a quiet understanding had settled, one that Elena hated seeing in his face. She checked her phone. Her father's last message still sat on the screen. Dad, stay put. They're coming back for you. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before she could type a response, the intercom crackled to life. Margaret Langley, please report to the cockpit immediately. Noah straightened in his seat. Elena's grip tightened around her phone. She didn't know what was happening up front, but she had a feeling Margaret Langley's problems were only just beginning. Margaret's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she made her way to the front of the plane. She could feel the weight of every step. Her pulse quickened. The captain never called her to the cockpit unless it was serious. She reached the door, exhaled slowly, and stepped inside. Captain Richard Hale sat in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Beside him, the first officer kept his focus on the controls, but the tension in the air made it clear he was fully aware of what was happening. The in-flight phone sat on the center console. The call was still active. Margaret swallowed hard. You asked for me? Captain Hale didn't look up at first. Instead, he pressed a button on the phone, switching it to speaker. A deep voice filled the small space, calm, controlled. Margaret Langley, this is Victor Monroe. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking the name. Everyone in the airline knew Victor Monroe. His name carried weight, more than any executive, more than the CEO. He was the owner, the man who had built this airline from the ground up, the man whose children she had just humiliated. Captain Hale leaned back in his chair. Mr. Monroe has a few questions for you. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Margaret's palms were damp as she clasped them in front of her. Victor cut her off. Did you verify my children's tickets before asking them to move? Her throat tightened. She hesitated. I was following protocol. The silence on the other end was deafening. Captain Hale's jaw twitched. He was watching her, waiting. That's not what I asked. She swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. No, sir. Another long pause. So you assumed they didn't belong in first class? The words weren't loud. They weren't accusatory, but they held a weight that made her legs feel weak. I misjudged the situation, she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. Victor Monroe let out a slow breath. And did you question any other first-class passengers the same way? Margaret felt her stomach drop. She didn't need to answer. Her silence spoke for itself. Captain Hale shook his head slightly. His disappointment was clear. Victor's voice returned, still steady. Still dangerous. Margaret Langley, you will personally ensure my children receive the same level of service as every other first-class passenger. You will publicly apologize to them in front of the cabin. And when this flight lands, you will explain yourself to the executive board. Victor Monroe's voice was final. Margaret Langley's hands trembled slightly. I understand, she managed to say. Good. The call ended with a soft click. Captain Richard Hale leaned forward, adjusting his headset. You heard the man, he said, his tone carrying no sympathy. Now fix your mistake. Margaret nodded stiffly, turned on her heel, and stepped out of the cockpit. Her heart pounded as she made her way back through the first-class cabin. Passengers watched her now. Some pretended not to be interested, but others made no effort to hide their curiosity. She reached Elena and Noah's row and stopped. Every part of her wanted to turn away, to avoid this moment entirely. But she couldn't. Not this time. Taking a deep breath, she forced her voice to remain even. I need to apologize, she said. Elena didn't look up right away. She ran her fingers along the edge of the armrest, her expression unreadable. Noah, however, was watching Margaret closely. I made an assumption, Margaret continued, carefully choosing her words, and I was wrong. Silence. Noah shifted in his seat, glancing at his sister. Finally, Elena turned her head, meeting Margaret's gaze. Are you apologizing because you mean it? She asked quietly. Or because you got caught? Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent years in control, years setting the rules. And now, for the first time, she realized she had no power here. She swallowed hard. But she had no answer, and Alina knew it. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Margaret stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had issued the apology. But Elena's questions still lingered in the air, unanswered. Noah fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie. He glanced up at his sister, waiting to see what she would say next. The tension in the cabin was palpable. A few passengers tried to act as if they weren't listening, but the occasional glances made it obvious. Alina tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Well? Margaret inhaled deeply, forcing herself to remain composed. I was wrong to ask you to leave, she said, carefully choosing each word. I should have verified your tickets before making any assumptions. Elena didn't blink. That's not what I asked. Margaret's fingers twitched slightly. She had always been the one in control, the one setting the tone in situations like this. But this wasn't like any situation she had ever handled before. She had removed these two kids from their seats without a second thought. And now? Now, she was being forced to acknowledge it. Noah finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Would you have done the same thing if we looked different? Margaret's throat went dry. She didn't have an answer to that. At least, not one she could say out loud. Elena watched her carefully, her sharp eyes catching the flicker of hesitation in Margaret's expression. That was all the confirmation she needed. You can't even say it, Elena murmured, shaking her head slightly. Margaret felt her stomach twist. She had spent years believing she was always right, that her decisions were unquestionable. But now, standing here, under the weight of Elena's gaze, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. Her job required quick thinking. Gut instincts. She had always trusted her ability to read people, to spot issues before they became real problems. But today, she had been wrong. And not just about a seating issue. She had been wrong about them. Margaret cleared her throat, glancing around the cabin as if hoping for an escape. But there wasn't one. Not with the passengers watching. Not with the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She inhaled slowly. I should not have judged you, she said finally, her voice quieter now. I was wrong to assume you didn't belong here. Noah blinked, looking up at his sister. Elena studied Margaret's face. The words had been spoken, but there was still something hesitant about them. Okay, Elena said simply. Margaret frowned slightly. Okay? Elena nodded, leaning back in her seat. Yeah, you said what you needed to say. She exhaled. I don't need anything else from you. Margaret's stomach sank at the dismissal. She had expected anger, had even braced herself for a confrontation. But this quiet, collected response was worse. Noah turned to Elena. You don't want her to say more? Elena exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. It's not about what she says now, she murmured. It's about what she does next. Margaret Langley felt her throat tighten. Elena didn't want words. She wanted proof. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment longer before nodding stiffly. If there's anything you need during the flight, she said, her voice more subdued now, please let me know. Neither of them responded. Margaret turned and walked away, her steps lacking their usual sharpness as she disappeared down the aisle. Noah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He leaned closer to his sister. Do you think she meant it? Elena was quiet for a moment. I don't know, Noah sighed. I still don't feel right sitting here. Elena turned her head slightly, watching the passengers around them. Some still stole glances in their direction. Others looked away quickly when she met their gaze. The energy had shifted, but she wasn't sure if it was guilt or just discomfort. She glanced out the window, watching as the last of the bags were loaded onto the plane. Her phone buzzed in her lap. Dad. Everything taken care of? Elena typed back quickly. Me. She apologized. Not sure if she meant it, but yeah, we're back in our seats. The dots appeared almost immediately, showing he was typing. Good. Sit tight. This isn't over yet. Elena's stomach fluttered. She had a feeling he didn't mean that for her. Margaret moved briskly toward the galley, her mind racing. She had delivered the apology. She had done what was required of her. And yet, the unease in her chest hadn't disappeared. The The feeling of control slipping from her grip was foreign, unsettling. She had spent years in this role, commanding the cabin with authority, ensuring everything ran exactly as it should. But today, she had miscalculated. She reached for a cup, pouring herself some water with slightly shaky hands. The sound of footsteps behind her made her tense. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Lena Carter. The younger flight attendant leaned against the counter, watching her. "You okay?" Lena asked, her tone carefully neutral. Margaret stiffened. "I don't need your concern." Lena raised an eyebrow. "It didn't sound like they accepted your apology." Margaret shot her a sharp look. "That's not your business." Lena tilted her head slightly. "Isn't it?" She crossed her arms. "Look, I don't like getting involved in things like this, but I have to ask, did you even check their tickets before pulling them out of their seats?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the cup. She didn't answer. Lena scoffed, shaking her head. "You didn't, did you?" Margaret turned to face her. "I made a judgment based on what?" Lena cut in. "On how they looked?" The word stung. Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Lena exhaled, shaking her head. "You know, you made them feel like they didn't belong. That kid, Noah, he looked excited to be here when they first boarded. Now, he won't even look up from his seat." She let the word settle before adding, "That's on you." Margaret swallowed. Something uncomfortable twisted inside her. Lena sighed and pushed away from the counter. "You might have fixed this flight," she said. "But this isn't over for you. You know that, right?" Margaret said nothing. Lena gave her one last look before walking back toward the cabin, leaving Margaret standing there, gripping the edge of the counter. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she'd ever feel in control again. Back in first class, Elena glanced at Noah. He had barely moved since Margaret left. His fingers tapped absently against the armrest, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" she asked softly. Noah hesitated before shrugging. "I don't know." Elena sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. "Dad's handling it," she reminded him. Noah nodded slowly. "Yeah," he muttered. "But will it change anything?" Elena was about to respond when the intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're preparing for takeoff. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin." Noah straightened in his seat as the plane began to move. As the plane began to taxi, Elena glanced around. The energy in first class still felt different. People had seen what happened. Some passengers pretended nothing had occurred, but others stole quiet glances in their direction. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored suit cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he muttered, his gaze focused ahead. "That never should have happened." Elena turned her head slightly. "But it did." The man looked uncomfortable, nodding stiffly before returning his attention to the screen in front of him. Elena didn't say anything else. The plane lifted off the ground, but the weight in her chest remained. As they ascended into the sky, she glanced at her phone. Another message from her father had come in. "Dad, we land in 3 hours. I'll be waiting at the gate." Elena's grip tightened around her phone. She didn't know exactly what her father had planned, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the last conversation Margaret Langley would be forced to have today. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane leveled in the sky. But the tension in first class had not disappeared. Elena sat upright, her fingers idly running along the edge of her armrest, her mind replaying everything that had just happened. Noah had barely touched the in-flight screen in front of him. Unusual. Normally he'd be excited to scroll through the movie selection. But now, he just sat there, staring out the window as the clouds rolled past. Elena could still feel the weight of the silence around them. The passengers who had witnessed everything were pretending to be occupied. Yet their stolen glances gave them away. It was funny. When she and Noah had been thrown off the plane, no one had said a word. But now that they were back, suddenly, everyone had an opinion. Even if they were too afraid to say it aloud. A flight attendant appeared beside them, but it wasn't Margaret Langley. It was Lena Carter. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked gently, her eyes flickering toward Noah before landing on Elena. "Or anything to drink?" Noah shook his head without looking up. Elena hesitated, then exhaled. "Just some water for him," she said. Lena nodded quickly and stepped away. Moments later, she returned, setting a glass of water carefully on the tray in front of Noah. He muttered a small, quiet thanks, but still didn't lift his head. Lena lingered for a second, as if debating whether to say something more. Finally, she spoke. "I'm really sorry about what happened earlier." Elena raised an eyebrow, studying her carefully. "Are you saying that because you mean it?" she asked, "or because you saw how things played out?" Lena didn't flinch. "Because I mean it." Elena gave a slow nod. "Then why didn't you say anything before?" Lena swallowed, shifting slightly. "Because," she hesitated, "I've seen things like this happen before, and I always told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." She looked down, exhaling. "That doesn't make it right, though." Elena didn't respond. She just watched Lena for a moment before turning to Noah, who had finally taken a small sip of water. "You work with her, don't you?" Elena asked, bringing her gaze back to Lena. Lena nodded. "Yeah, she's been here longer than I have. A lot of people don't question her decisions." "And what about you?" Lena hesitated, then finally said, "I used to be one of those people. I'm not anymore." Elena tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Lena let out a slow breath. "Because today, I saw how it looks from the other side." Elena leaned back in her seat, considering that. At least Lena was being honest. That was more than she could say for Margaret Langley. Lena straightened. "If you need anything, just let me know." Elena nodded once. "Thanks." Lena walked away, and for the first time since reboarding, Noah finally turned to Elena. "You believe her?" he asked. Elena sighed. "I don't know. Maybe." Noah pressed his lips together. "At least she said something." "Yeah," Elena muttered, but she only said it when it was safe to. Noah didn't respond, but the meaning in Elena's words lingered between them. The flight continued, the minutes dragging on. Elena checked her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through messages from friends, people who had no idea what had just happened. Noah eventually pulled up a movie, but he wasn't really watching it. Then suddenly, an announcement came over the intercom. The intercom crackled to life. "Margaret Langley, please report to the cockpit immediately." Elena's eyes snapped toward the front of the cabin. Noah frowned. Passengers exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even Lena Carter, who had been passing out drinks a few rows ahead, stopped mid-step. Elena folded her arms. "Dad must be handling things already." Noah blinked. "But we're still in the air." "Exactly." They watched as Margaret stiffly made her way toward the front, disappearing behind the curtain leading to the cockpit. The moment she was gone, whispers rippled through first class. A few passengers leaned toward one another, murmuring under their breath. Some looked toward Elena and Noah again. But this time, their curiosity was different. They weren't just staring at two kids who had been removed from their seats. Now, they were staring at two kids whose father had enough power to summon a flight attendant mid-flight. Noah turned to Elena, his eyes wide. "What do you think's happening up there?" Elena smirked slightly. "I think Margaret Langley just realized this is a lot bigger than she thought." And for the first time since they boarded this flight, she felt the balance of power shift. Margaret's breath felt heavier as she stepped into the cockpit. The door shut behind her with a quiet click. The enclosed space suddenly felt much smaller than usual. Captain Richard Hale sat in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Beside him, the first officer kept his focus on the instruments, but the stiffness in his posture made it clear that he was aware of the situation unfolding behind him. But it wasn't the captain's silence that made Margaret's stomach twist. It was the voice coming through the speaker of the in-flight phone. "Margaret Langley." The voice was calm, controlled, but carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "Victor Monroe." She forced herself to stay composed. "Sir, don't bother." He cut her off. "I'm not interested in excuses." Margaret's jaw tightened. Captain Hale leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on her. "Corporate has already been informed of what happened," he said. "Mr. Monroe has requested an immediate review of your conduct upon landing." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. A review?" Victor's voice returned. "I own this airline, Miss Langley, which means when a situation like this happens, I have the authority to ensure it's handled properly. And believe me, it will be." Margaret gripped the edge of the nearest seat for support. "Sir, I acknowledge my mistake, but do you?" Victor's voice was steady, almost too calm. "Because I have reports from passengers, your fellow crew members, and even the captain, and they all suggest that you didn't think it was a mistake at all. until you were forced to correct it. Captain Hale watched the color drain from her face. "Miss Langley," he said, his voice quieter but firm, "you didn't just embarrass 2 passengers. You embarrassed this airline." Margaret felt her throat tighten. Victor let the silence stretch. "You didn't question any other first-class passengers. You didn't stop anyone else to check their tickets. Just my children." A pause. "I wonder why." Margaret's breath hitched. She knew exactly why, and worse, she knew that he knew exactly why. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. "I wasn't thinking." Victor's voice didn't rise, but the weight of it was crushing. "No, you were thinking. You just weren't thinking correctly." Margaret's hands were ice cold. Captain Hale sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Monroe, what would you like us to do before landing?" Victor didn't hesitate. "She will personally ensure my children receive the highest level of service for the remainder of this flight." Margaret winced at the instruction. "Not because I care about their comfort. They already know they belong in first class. But because I want the rest of the passengers to see what it looks like when someone is forced to acknowledge their mistake." The humiliation burned in Margaret's chest. She swallowed hard. "And upon landing?" Captain Hale asked. Victor's answer was immediate. "Security will be waiting for her at the gate. She will be escorted directly to the executive office, where she will explain herself to the board." A heavy pause. "If her explanation is unsatisfactory, she will no longer be employed by this airline." Margaret's stomach lurched. "Sir, please, Click. The call ended, and just like that, her fate was sealed. The call ended with a quiet click. Margaret Langley stood there, frozen. Captain Richard Hale exhaled and turned toward her. "You should get back to the cabin," he said. His tone was even, but the disapproval was impossible to miss. "I suggest you make good use of the time you have left." Margaret nodded stiffly, though her legs felt weak beneath her as she stepped out of the cockpit. For the first time in her career, she had no control over what came next. Back in first class, Elena scrolled through her phone, her expression unreadable. Noah had finally picked a movie to watch, but she could tell he wasn't really paying attention. Passengers whispered. Their gazes flickered toward the front of the plane, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, Margaret Langley emerged. She walked slowly down the aisle, her expression carefully composed. But Elena could see it in her posture, the stiffness in her movements. This wasn't the same woman who had stood in front of them earlier, demanding they move. This was a woman who had just realized, for the first time in a long time, maybe ever. She was on the other side of the power dynamic. She reached their row and stopped, silence stretched. Noah glanced up, shifting uncomfortably. Margaret inhaled sharply, then spoke. "Can I offer you anything? Drinks? A meal? Anything at all?" Her voice was tight, controlled. Noah looked up at Elena as if unsure how to respond. Elena studied Margaret's face, the forced politeness in her expression. This wasn't genuine. This wasn't an apology. This was survival. Elena leaned back in her seat, folding her arms. "You didn't ask us that when we first sat down." Margaret's lips pressed together. "I'd like to correct that now." Elena tilted her head slightly. "Would you be doing this if my last name wasn't Monroe?" Margaret's face remained neutral, but Elena saw the flicker of shame in her eyes. "No." Elena murmured the answer for her. "You wouldn't." Noah exhaled beside her, suddenly exhausted. "I'll just take some juice," he muttered. Margaret nodded stiffly. Right away, she turned, disappearing toward the galley. Noah sighed, leaning back in his seat. "That felt weird." Elena didn't take her eyes off the aisle. "That's because she's not sorry." Noah hesitated. "Then what is she?" Elena's expression didn't change. "She's scared." Noah shifted in his seat. "Is that enough?" Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No, but it's a start." When Margaret returned with the drink, passengers watched her closely. Some with quiet amusement, others with judgment. And in that moment, Elena knew. Margaret felt every single one of those stares. For the first time, she was the one being scrutinized. For the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. She placed the juice down on Noah's tray with careful precision. Her fingers were steady, despite the storm raging inside her. She forced a tight smile and turned away quickly, eager to put as much distance between herself and the two siblings as possible. But she could still feel the weight of their gazes, Elena's calm, unreadable stare, Noah's hesitant confusion. It was a feeling she wasn't used to. She was the one who set the rules, the one who dictated order in the cabin. And yet now, she was the one waiting for judgment. As Margaret moved through the aisle, she felt it. Every whisper, every glance from the first-class passengers. Some of them were merely curious. Others seemed smug, as if relishing the fact that she was now the one walking on eggshells. A few, she suspected, had likely done the same thing she had done before. Silently judged the two kids when they first sat down, assumed they didn't belong, and only now did they feel guilty about it. Margaret reached the galley, gripping the counter tightly. Her breathing was shallow. How had this happened? One moment, she had been in control, running the cabin as she always did. The next, she had been pulled into the cockpit and forced to answer to the most powerful man in the airline industry. A man whose children she had humiliated. A man who wasn't going to let this go. The truth of the situation sat in her chest like a stone. She wasn't just dealing with a passenger complaint, she was dealing with Victor Monroe. And now, security would be waiting for her at the gate. The executive board would be waiting for her. She had never been in trouble before, not like this. For years, passengers had complained that Margaret Langley was too strict, too firm, but nothing had ever escalated past a simple written report. She had been untouchable. Not anymore. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, inhaling slowly. Maybe, just maybe, if she handled the rest of this flight perfectly, if she showed real remorse, the board might show her mercy. Maybe Victor Monroe wouldn't fire her. Her fingers twitched. Taking a steadying breath, she straightened her uniform, put on the most professional expression she could manage, and stepped back into the cabin. Passengers noticed her return, but she ignored them, forcing herself to focus. She needed to get through this flight without making things worse. She needed to be perfect. Margaret moved quietly through first class, checking on passengers. She refilled drinks, adjusted tray tables, offered warm towels with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hated this feeling. The uncertainty, the powerlessness. And every time she glanced toward Elena and Noah's row, she could see it. The way Elena was watching her, studying her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. She knows, Margaret thought bitterly. She knows I'm not really sorry. She knows I just don't want to lose my job. Margaret swallowed hard and kept moving. Elena tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest, watching as Margaret moved through the aisle with forced precision. Everything about her posture, her movements, screamed discomfort. She wasn't acting out of kindness, she was acting out of fear. Noah sipped his juice quietly beside her, his shoulders still slightly slumped. The excitement he'd felt before the flight had never returned. The damage had already been done. Elena glanced at the other passengers. Some had gone back to their books and movies, pretending as if nothing had happened. But she caught the way some of them still looked up when Margaret passed by, whispering amongst themselves. It wasn't just her who had lost control. Margaret had lost their respect too. Elena checked her phone, another message from her father. "Dad, landing in 2 hours. Security is set. Sit tight." She exhaled slowly. 2 hours. She wondered if Margaret realized what was waiting for her when they landed. Noah shifted in his seat. "I kind of feel bad for her," he muttered. Elena turned her head slightly. "Why?" Noah hesitated. "I don't know. She looks nervous. Like she knows she messed up." Elena studied him for a moment. Noah had always been softer than she was, more willing to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. "That doesn't change what she did," Elena said quietly. "I know," Noah admitted. "But what if she really is sorry?" Elena exhaled. "Then she'll show it. When no one is forcing her to." Noah nodded slowly, but she could tell he wasn't completely convinced. Margaret returned to their row one last time. "Would either of you like a blanket or pillow?" she asked stiffly. The words were robotic. "Practiced." Elena didn't answer right away. She just looked at her. Really looked at her. The woman standing in front of her wasn't the same Margaret Langley who had ordered them off the plane with confidence and certainty. That woman had been sure of herself, sure of her authority. This woman? This woman knew she had no authority left. "No," Elena said simply. Margaret nodded, looking relieved to be dismissed. She turned and walked away without another word. Noah sighed. "I still feel bad." "You don't have to," Elena murmured. "She made her choice. She just doesn't like the consequences." Noah didn't say anything after that. Elena returned her gaze to the window, watching as the sky stretched endlessly before them. 2 more hours, then they would land. And for Margaret Langley, her real problems were only just beginning. The 2-hour stretch in the air felt longer than it should have. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the approach of evening. Most passengers had settled into their seats. Some lost in their books, others watching movies or dozing off. The quiet hum of the engines filled the air. But even in the stillness, tension lingered. Elena watched the time tick down on the screen in front of her. The estimated arrival kept adjusting by a few minutes, but the final destination never changed. For years, Margaret Langley had been untouchable. Passengers had complained before, some thought she was too strict, too firm, but nothing had ever escalated beyond a simple written report. Not until today. She squeezed her eyes shut, inhaling slowly. Maybe, just maybe, if she handled the rest of the flight perfectly, if she showed real remorse, the board might show her mercy. Maybe Victor Monroe wouldn't fire her. Her fingers twitched. Taking a steadying breath, she straightened her uniform, put on the most professional expression she could manage, and stepped back into the cabin. Passengers noticed, but she ignored them. She forced herself to focus. She needed to get through this flight without making things worse. She needed to be perfect. Margaret moved quietly through first class, checking on passengers. She refilled drinks, adjusted tray tables, and offered warm towels with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hated this feeling. The uncertainty, the powerlessness. And every time she glanced toward Elena and Noah's row, she could see it, the way Elena was watching her, studying her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. She knows, Margaret thought bitterly. She knows I'm not really sorry. She knows I just don't want to lose my job. Margaret swallowed hard and kept moving. Elena tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest. Watching. Margaret moved through the aisle with forced precision. Everything about her posture, her movements, screamed discomfort. She wasn't acting out of kindness. She was acting out of fear. Beside her, Noah sipped his juice quietly. His shoulders were still slightly slumped. The excitement he had felt before the flight had never returned. The damage had already been done. Elena glanced at the other passengers. Some had gone back to their books and movies, pretending as if nothing had happened. But she caught the way some of them still looked up when Margaret passed by, whispering amongst themselves. It wasn't just Elena who had lost respect for her. Margaret Langley had lost it from everyone else too. Elena checked her phone. Another message from her father. Dad, landing in 2 hours, security is set, sit tight. She exhaled slowly. 2 hours. She wondered if Margaret realized what was waiting for her when they landed. Noah shifted in his seat. I kind of feel bad for her, he muttered. Elena turned her head slightly. Why? Noah hesitated. I don't know, he admitted. She looks nervous, like she knows she messed up. Elena studied him for a moment. Noah had always been softer than she was, more willing to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. That doesn't change what she did, Elena said quietly. I know, Noah admitted. But what if she really is sorry? Elena exhaled. Then she'll show it when no one is forcing her to. Noah nodded slowly, but she could tell he wasn't completely convinced. Margaret returned to their row one last time. Would either of you like a blanket or pillow? She asked stiffly. The words were robotic, practiced. Elena didn't answer right away. She just looked at her. Really looked at her. The woman standing in front of her wasn't the same Margaret Langley who had ordered them off the plane with confidence and certainty. That woman had been sure of herself, sure of her authority. This woman? This woman knew she had no authority left. No, Elena said simply. Margaret nodded, looking relieved to be dismissed. She turned and walked away without another word. Noah sighed. I still feel bad. You don't have to, Elena murmured. She made her choice. She just doesn't like the consequences. Noah didn't say anything after that. Elena returned her gaze to the window, watching. The sky stretched endlessly before them. 2 more hours. Then they would land. And for Margaret Langley, her real problems were only just beginning. The weight of silence. The 2-hour stretch in the air felt longer than it should have. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the approach of evening. Most passengers had settled into their seats, some lost in their books, others watching movies or dozing off. The quiet hum of the engines filled the air. But even in the stillness, tension lingered. Elena watched the time tick down on the screen in front of her. The estimated arrival kept adjusting by a few minutes, but the final destination never changed. Across the aisle, a soft voice broke the quiet. "I just want to say, I'm really sorry for what happened to you two." Elena turned her head. It was the older woman from earlier, the one who had spoken up after they were forced back on the plane. She sat 2 rows across, reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, a gentle expression on her face. Elena studied her carefully. "Why are you sorry?" The woman hesitated, folding her hands in her lap. "Because I was sitting right here when it happened," she admitted. "And I didn't say anything." Elena felt her chest tighten slightly. The woman exhaled, as if working through the words in real time. "I saw how that flight attendant looked at you before she even spoke. I saw the way she questioned you, but not the others. And I knew." Her voice dropped slightly. "I knew it wasn't right." She sighed. "But I didn't speak up until after your father got involved. And that doesn't sit right with me." Elena let the words settle for a moment. She had expected apologies from Margaret Langley, from corporate, even from other airline staff. But she hadn't expected this, an apology from someone who had stayed silent. "You were scared," Elena said simply. "That's why you didn't say anything." The woman's face flushed slightly, but she nodded. "I was." Elena tilted her head slightly. "Scared of what?" The woman hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "Causing a scene, maybe. Getting involved in something I thought wasn't my place." She exhaled, shaking her head. "Or maybe I was scared of what it would mean if I acknowledged what was really happening." Elena studied her carefully. She wasn't like Margaret Langley. There was no forced apology here. No script written by corporate to save face. This was real. Noah stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "What's going on?" The woman turned to him with a small, kind smile. "I was just telling your sister that I should have spoken up sooner." Noah blinked sleepily, looking between them. Then he shrugged. "Well, you're saying it now." The woman smiled softly. "I suppose that's something." Elena nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "It is." Lena Carter gave a soft, knowing smile. "No," she admitted. "I guess it's not." She stepped back. "Let me know if you need anything before landing." As she walked away, Elena turned toward Noah, who had been watching the exchange quietly. "You think she really means it?" he asked, his voice low. Elena considered the question for a moment. "Maybe," she said finally. Noah was quiet for a beat before nodding. "Dad's gonna fire her, isn't he?" Elena didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted toward Margaret Langley, watching as she moved through the cabin, head held high even though everything around her was falling apart. "Yeah," Elena murmured. "I think he is." And for the first time, she wasn't sure if that was enough. Margaret Langley wasn't just losing her job, she was losing her reputation. The respect she had built over the years. And that might hurt more than anything else. But that was the thing about actions. Once they were done, they couldn't be undone. And Margaret Langley was finally learning that lesson, the hard way. The final hour of the flight dragged on, thick with tension that never quite faded. Margaret had retreated to the galley, avoiding unnecessary interactions, likely trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. Elena could feel the shift in the cabin. Not just in the way the passengers reacted, but in the way the crew carried themselves. No one spoke about what had happened. Yet it hovered in the air like an unshakable weight. Noah had finally started watching his movie, but Elena could tell he was still thinking. His fingers drummed lightly against his knee, his mind working, even as his eyes stayed fixed on the screen. He always did that when something bothered him. Went quiet, but never stopped thinking. Elena checked her phone. No new messages from her father. She didn't need them. She already knew what was waiting at the gate. Security? Corporate executives. A reckoning. Margaret thought she had already been through the worst of it. She thought the forced apology and the stares from passengers were the full weight of her punishment. She had no idea. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into New York International Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Noah sat up straighter, stretching his arms. Finally, Elena exhaled, glancing toward the front of the cabin. Margaret had stepped back out. Her expression was unreadable, her movements automatic as she prepared for landing. She handed out hot towels, adjusted passengers' trays, did everything by the book, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. For the first time in her career, she was uncertain about her future. As she reached Elena and Noah's row, she hesitated for the briefest moment before speaking. "Tray tables up, please," she said, her voice hollow. Elena didn't move right away. She studied Margaret's face, searching for something. Some sign of real regret. Something beyond the fear of losing her job. She found nothing. Elena folded her tray table up and sat back in her seat. Noah did the same, though he refused to look at Margaret. Margaret lingered for a second longer, then moved on. The plane dipped slightly as it began its final approach. Elena leaned her head against the window, watching. The city lights came into view. This was almost over, or maybe, for Margaret Langley, it was only just beginning. As soon as the wheels touched the ground, passengers reached for their phones, eager to reconnect with the world outside the plane. Elena's phone vibrated almost immediately. "Dad, I'm at the gate." A single sentence, no unnecessary details, no reassurances, just a statement of fact. He was here. Elena turned to Noah. "Dad's waiting for us." Noah nodded but didn't say anything. He already knew what that meant. The plane taxied toward the gate. The usual routine unfolded. Seat belts clicking open, passengers shifting in their seats, crew members preparing for arrival. But there was an added layer of tension, one that had nothing to do with turbulence or delays. Margaret hadn't moved from her spot near the galley. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her posture was unnaturally stiff. She wasn't waiting for the passengers. She wasn't waiting for the paperwork. She was waiting for her fate. Elena checked her phone again. Another message from her father. She didn't even need to open it to know what it said. Margaret Langley thought she had control when she ordered them off the plane. She thought her judgment was absolute. She thought there would be no consequences. She was wrong. And now, she was about to find out just how wrong she had been. Victor Monroe didn't do things quietly. This wasn't going to be a private meeting in some back office. This was going to be a statement. Elena exhaled slowly, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "Dad, security is already in place. The executives have been notified." Noah sat up straighter, stretching his arms as he prepared to exit. "You think she knows what's coming?" he asked. Elena glanced toward Margaret Langley. "Oh, she knows," she murmured. The fastened seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers gathered their bags. The energy in the cabin was different now. Some people were in a rush to leave. Others were deliberately waiting, wanting to see what would unfold. Then came the real moment of truth. The doors opened. A uniformed security officer stepped inside. Standing just past the jet bridge, he wasn't blocking the way, wasn't making a scene, but his presence alone was enough to cause a stir. Passengers glanced between him and Margaret Langley. Murmurs started up again. Margaret's face drained of color. She had hoped that she would be allowed to handle this quietly, that maybe she could explain herself in private. But Victor Monroe didn't do things quietly. As first-class passengers continued to gather their belongings, the security officer stepped forward. "Miss Langley," he said, his tone polite but firm, "you need to come with us." Passengers froze. Margaret inhaled sharply, glancing around, as if looking for an escape. But there wasn't one. She was done. Lena Carter, the younger flight attendant, shifted uncomfortably. Her expression caught between sympathy and the understanding that there was nothing she could do. Noah gripped the straps of his backpack. "Whoa," he whispered. Elena didn't look away. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to protest. But no words came out. She was used to having authority, used to having the power to dictate how things went. But not today. The passengers who had once looked to her for guidance now looked at her with judgment. The same whispers that had followed Elena and Noah off the plane earlier were now directed at her. She was the one being watched. She was the one being doubted. And worst of all, she had done it to herself. Captain Harrison Lowe stepped out of the cockpit, his expression tight with professionalism. He didn't acknowledge Margaret Langley directly, but he did nod toward the security officer. "She's all yours." That was it. That was the moment it became official. Margaret Langley had lost. The security officer gestured toward the jet bridge. "This way, ma'am." Elena watched as Margaret The woman who had ordered them off the plane without hesitation, the woman who had once walked through this cabin with certainty, now took the slowest steps of her life. The whispers followed her. Just like they had followed Elena and Noah earlier, except this time, no one was looking away. She disappeared through the jet bridge, and just like that, she was gone. The flight attendants pretended to carry on as usual, ushering passengers toward the exit, but the energy had shifted. Noah let out a low breath. That was intense. Elena stood, adjusting her bag. Let's go. As they stepped off the plane, the terminal felt almost too bright, too big. But none of that mattered. Because standing just ahead, waiting near the gate, with an expression that gave nothing away, was Victor Monroe. And as they walked toward him, Elena knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The man who needed no introduction. Victor Monroe stood just beyond the gate, his posture straight, hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice or make a scene to command attention. His presence alone was enough. The moment Elena and Noah stepped off the jet bridge, his gaze softened, but only slightly. He gave them a slow once-over, scanning their faces as if making sure they were unharmed. "Are you both okay?" he asked. His voice steady, even. Noah shifted beside Elena, nodding quickly. "Yeah, we're fine." Elena exhaled. "We're fine, Dad." Victor studied her for a beat longer, then nodded, satisfied. For now. But there was something unreadable in his expression. Something quiet but sharp, a calculation happening beneath the surface. Then he turned slightly, looking past them, toward the jet bridge. Margaret Langley emerged, flanked by two corporate executives and the security officer who had escorted her off the plane. She looked smaller than before, her confidence stripped away, her uniform still perfectly pressed. But now, it felt like a hollow shield. Margaret Langley's uniform was still pristine, but now, it felt like a hollow shield. Passengers exiting the plane stole quick glances her way. Their whispers continued as they passed. Some even stopped nearby, pretending to check their phones, just to witness whatever was about to unfold. Victor Monroe didn't move, didn't react. As Margaret was led toward him, she stopped a few feet away, her throat tightening as she forced herself to meet his gaze. There was no mistaking the power dynamic now. Margaret had spent years deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now, she was the one being questioned. One of the executives, David Langford, stepped forward, a senior board member, his neatly pressed suit a reminder of corporate authority. He glanced between Victor and Margaret before clearing his throat. "Mr. Monroe," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we are prepared to address this matter immediately." Victor didn't acknowledge him at first. He kept his focus on Margaret, watching the way she shifted her weight slightly, her fingers twitching at her sides. Finally, he spoke. "You removed my children from their seats." His voice wasn't loud, but it was felt, without checking their tickets. Margaret swallowed. I made an error in judgment," she said carefully. Victor tilted his head slightly. "An error in judgment?" Her breath caught. "I didn't. You humiliated them in front of an entire cabin," Victor continued, his tone still even, controlled. "You made an assumption, not based on their behavior, not based on their conduct, but based on what?" The pause was suffocating. Margaret's lips parted slightly, but she had no answer. Victor let the silence linger, then turned to David Langford. "I assume the airline will be taking immediate disciplinary action?" Langford straightened. "Yes, sir. Ms. Langley will be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. There will be an internal review, and based on the findings," Victor held up a hand, silencing him. "No need for a review." Margaret flinched. "She's done." Victor's voice was calm, but the words landed with finality. Margaret's breath hitched. "Please, Mr. Monroe." Victor's expression remained unreadable. "You had no hesitation when you ordered my children off that plane. You didn't stop to consider if you were making a mistake. You didn't second-guess yourself when you embarrassed them. You were certain. Now, so am I." The weight of his words pressed down on her like a crushing force. David Langford nodded stiffly. "Understood, sir." He turned to Margaret. "Effective immediately, your employment with the airline is terminated." Margaret blinked rapidly. But there was nothing left to say. Security stepped forward, waiting to escort her out. For the first time, she was the one being removed. Victor shifted his attention back to Elena and Noah. "Let's go," he said simply. Noah glanced back once, his eyes widening slightly as he watched Margaret being led away. Alina, however, didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The lesson had already been learned. As they walked through the terminal, passengers still whispered, some glancing between them. And the scene unfolding behind them, Noah tugged at Alina's sleeve. So that's it? She's just gone? Alina nodded. She made her choice. Noah hesitated. Do you feel bad? Alina thought about it. Did she? Did she feel sorry for Margaret Langley? The woman who had assumed they didn't belong. The woman who had been forced to face her own judgment in front of an entire flight. She glanced at her father, his expression unreadable as he walked beside them, his presence commanding, even in silence. Then she thought about Noah, how excited he had been when they first boarded, how that excitement had been stolen from him the moment someone decided he didn't belong. She thought about the stares, the whispers, the silence from passengers who had watched it all happen and said nothing. Finally, she exhaled and looked forward. No, she said it firmly. I don't. Noah nodded slowly, as if understanding for the first time that justice didn't always feel like kindness. As they exited the terminal, the air outside was cooler than she expected. The sky had darkened slightly. The city was alive with movement. This was over, but it would never be forgotten.